there's so many things that Brie has in terms of accolades and accomplishments that I would have to spend all night reciting them all, and I'm tired of doing that already, so I'm going to go ahead and dispense with that and just say, welcome back to System Update, Briahna. It's great to see you as always. Thanks for being here.
Thank you, Glenn. You're way too generous, but I appreciate it.
I totally agree. That's what everyone says to me all the time. You're way too generous, and I am working on it, which is why I cut myself off. All right, let's start with this speech that I think all of us can agree was very moving, was very emotionally inspiring, which was Joe Biden's State of the Union address. He stood on his feet for over an hour without falling over. He didn't drool all that often. He was able to read those lines with some degree of acuity in a way that really excited the liberal pundits and Democratic Party operatives in our media. They're very excited now about the fact that he seems to have dispelled these concerns about cognitive decline. Now, I don't want to spend a lot of time in the theater of the State of the Union address, although maybe the theatrical part is the most important part. So let me just ask you one question about that. What did you make of the performance itself?
I mean, you joke, obviously you're being sarcastic, but I saw a lot of liberal coverage that said exactly that were kind of unironically applauding his performance, saying it was one of the best State of the Unions they've ever seen. And if you, like me, watched on C-SPAN because you have cut the cable cord and don't have access to some of the cable news coverage, you heard him had these conversations on the House floor, and a lot of people came up to him, a lot of Congress members came up to him and said exactly that my mom called from home and said it was the best State of the Union ever. And I don't know that if I'm in the Twilight Zone, I kind of feel like I'm the girl in that episode who looks normal and everyone else looks like a pig and they tell her she's the ugly one. But I had a very different reaction. And maybe it's because for me, the bar wasn't on the ground and I was less invested in whether or not he could kind of competently limp through reading a script as what the message of the actual address was. And I thought it was a really odd and perhaps disastrous choice to open talking about Ukraine at a time when there's so many Americans who feel like he has been flagging on domestic issues. In particular, there is a huge America First community, not just on the right, but also in the populist left, who were looking for him to come out and immediately address the ongoing concerns about inflation and the economy, and to spend so much time on foreign policy and on a foreign policy adventure that is increasingly unpopular just seemed very odd. And I'm sure we'll get into this more, but not to mention the kind of hand waving at the tragedy and the horror of the situation in Gaza without offering any meaningful course change from the basically rubber stamping of Netanyahu's agenda in the Gaza Strip.
You know, you can ask questions about Ukraine and extract different answers in polling data that have a pretty wide range in terms of whether people want to keep sending money, whether they want to support Ukraine and stand with them against Russia. But there's no question, as you said, that support has declined. But I think the more important thing is I can't imagine any person outside of the think tank world and the American pundit class that when they think about politics and the things that they want it to do for them, that anywhere near the top of their list is who governs various provinces in eastern Ukraine. I just can't imagine that that's true. And for him to start the State of the Union address so fanatical about this as though it's going to rally Americans to his side who have doubts about him is something that I agree was an extremely strange choice. I think one of the things that I perceive in the discourse today about this kind of celebratory spirit that a lot of these people have who are desperate for him to win is this notion that the reason why people perceive Biden as being incapacitated and, you know, basically someone with an old, dementia-riddled, melting brain, they think that the reason for that is because the media keeps telling them that, and that Republicans tell them that. It's like this very patronizing view of how American citizens form their opinions, that they're incapable of forming their own opinions based on what they see. Now, maybe there are some topics that are very complex, maybe the economy even, although I think even there people judge on their own personal experience. But when it comes to judging whether an old person is with it, we all have experiences in that, or most of us do, and we're all capable of trusting our own opinions in this. And for over 2 or 3 years, Americans have seen and believe strongly in this decline. Do you think it's even remotely possible that because he got jacked up for a speech for an hour and didn't fall on his face, literally, that they're now suddenly going to change their deeply entrenched view of how he's an old man who cannot perform the duties of his office?
I think he convinced the liberal pundit class who desperately needed a win, but no one else. I mean, I kept watching again on C-SPAN to some of the call-in segment, and the calls fell along two lines. There were people who were more conservative-leaning, who had critiques of the economy, or who maybe just didn't like him. That's fine, whatever. But there were also a lot of people who called in saying, "I'm frustrated with your position on Gaza." Neither of those was addressed, right? So the idea that it's a victory lap because he stood up and read, I think convinces no one. And I think you're right. I have talked to so many people who are frankly pro-Biden and are embedded in the Democratic Party, who are lobbyists and who have worked for Democratic campaigns, who are not just angry leftists like myself, who behind closed doors articulate concern about his age and mental fitness. When you've lost Ezra Klein, you're experiencing a real problem. And as I'm sure you're aware, he did a week or so ago this whole viral essay that a lot of liberals were upset about, saying that, hey, maybe Biden has the competency to actually be president because of all of the support that a president has, but does he have the stamina to actually run for president? Does he have the stamina to do events, to even compete in a general election debate? We all know that he shut down a Democratic primary and has done fewer press interviews than any other president in the recent historical memory. But it seems to be evidence of the fact that, no, he does not have the ability to campaign. So how are they planning to get him across the finish line, even if they can get him through an hour-long speech?
You know what's amazing, Bria? I remember in 2019 when people were talking about the primary as it was beginning, once it got down to Joe Biden versus Bernie Sanders, and you were obviously with the Sanders campaign at the time, anybody who raised the issue of whether Joe Biden was cognitively capable of handling a general election, and we all know he got saved by COVID and he didn't have to do much, but at the time nobody knew that, was told that they were being disgusting, that they were being immoral for even raising it. And what was driving me crazy was, I remember, and I documented this once in an article, that throughout 2018 and 2019, which is now 5 or 6 years ago, the people who were raising this concern and sounding that alarm were Democratic Party insiders saying, look, we're really worried that Joe Biden's going to get the nomination simply by virtue of the fact that it's his turn, that he was Obama's vice president, he's been around forever, because people don't understand that he's so cognitively impaired that he's not the same Joe Biden. And as soon as that was their only candidate against Bernie Sanders, they wanted to make it morally off limits to even mention it. Now here we are 6 years later, and obviously that's gotten worse. All right, let me ask you about the substance. One of the things that Biden announced last night that was signaled that he would was that the United States is going to spend a lot of money and deploy its military into creating a new maritime channel that will allow essentially a pier to be built so that the U.S. Navy and other navies can deliver aid by sea into Gaza, because obviously our good partner Israel, whose war we're funding and paying for, won't let us physically into Gaza with trucks. The easiest way to get in to deliver humanitarian aid to a starving population. At the same time, these airdrops have been continuing of a tiny number of baskets of food, maybe 10, 20, 30,000 a day for a population of 2 billion, including a few that killed people today when it dropped on them when the parachute didn't open. Do you think that there are people who are angry with Biden on the left, the people you were just referring to, who are being persuaded in any way by these kinds of gestures?
Absolutely not. And I got to give a lot of credit to the Uncommitted campaign and other Code Pink and other grassroots efforts to really be clear about the messaging of this issue, Jewish Voice for Peace, and all the rest. I was worried that, frankly, the tone shift the administration obviously felt the need to take right before the Michigan primary vote, where Joe Biden now famously stood there licking an ice cream cone and contemplating how much genocide he was going to let our allies do, and said, well, maybe we should have a little bit of a pause on the genocide. And then later soft launched Kamala Harris with this speech where she very boldly and valiantly declared that we must have a ceasefire, then took an almost comedic beat before saying for about 6 weeks. I think that people are not being fooled by it, again, as evidenced by the commentary that you've seen from people, not just on the left, I should point out, but regular kind of normie Democrats. Normal people see on their timeline on TikTok, which I really appreciated the segment that you just did, and elsewhere on social media, what the carnage is like in Gaza, and normal people can't countenance hearing about things like the Flower Massacre last week, where over 100 Palestinians are shot with bullets, NATO bullets, because they're starving and crowding around a truck that was so infrequent in northern Gaza that there's a sense of desperation. And the response from the IDF is to start shooting people in the head and elsewhere. Normal people see that and say, we need to do something about it. But our government sees that and people's reaction to it and says, we've got to ban TikTok and we've got to come up with a new messaging campaign to keep people on board this democratic train wreck until the general election. And the uncommitted vote, when you look at the trajectory over the primaries that we've seen so far, they didn't stop and start in Michigan. There was all of this rhetoric about how, okay, fine, Michigan, it didn't look good. There were 100,000 uncommitted votes when all they were going for was 10,000. But hey, look, this is the largest concentration of Arab Americans and Muslim Americans in the country. It's not going to be like that elsewhere. Well, how do you explain, what was it, 13% in North Carolina? How do you explain 30% of the vote, almost 30% of the vote, the primary vote in Hawaii was uncommitted voters? This is a campaign that is growing, not shrinking, and it's growing in proportion to the tragedy that is ongoing in Gaza. And unless Biden has a real plan to stop that tragedy, there's going to be significant consequences. Just one last thing I'll say about this is that I did a radar on rising, which is what we call our monologues, on Thursday, where I make the case that this problem is going to get worse toward the election and not better. And one of the things that I point to is projections of death that are expected to happen in Gaza, even if there were a ceasefire tomorrow, because of disease and of famine. And now the Democrats are banking on the idea that 1/6 is the date that's going to be looming large in people's heads, and that they're going to come out and vote to save democracy. My suspicion is that October 7th is going to be looming large in their heads, because people are going to be counting the months that have passed and the thousands and thousands of Palestinian deaths that could have been avoided if we weren't complicit in Benjamin Netanyahu's siege on Gaza.
I think the last part is the key. You know, I think it isn't just that Joe Biden has failed to stop this atrocity. Joe Biden, from the very beginning, flew to Israel almost immediately, stood by Benjamin Netanyahu, did what he's done his entire career, which is vowed unlimited and unblinking and full-fledged financial and military support to Israel, has made good on that promise to this very day, 5 months later, continues to support in every meaningful way possible, meaning not rhetorically, but diplomatically, militarily, and financially, what Israel is doing. It is just as much of an American war as it is an Israeli war, given how crucial of a role the Biden administration and the United States government is playing in enabling it to happen. I had on my show last night George Galloway, the newly elected member of parliament from the Workers' Party, who actually crushed both major parties in the UK, got more votes than each of them combined in his victory, and ran in part on opposition to UK support for Israel's destruction of Gaza. And I asked him, as somebody who is, somewhat older than you, much, much older than me, and who has seen a lot, I said to him, where in kind of this, on the range of atrocities, of things you've witnessed in your lifetime, do you place what's happening in Gaza? And he said, look, of at least of the things I've been able to see, right? I can't speak to the things we didn't see because it was before social media or media wasn't there. But of the things I've seen, this is by far the most horrifying. Where do you place what's happening in Gaza in terms of the atrocities that in your somewhat long lifetime you yourself have gotten to know and seen and written about and reported on?
Yeah, I mean, I think those caveats that you offer are important, that there are tragedies that we're not as aware of because of the kind of bias that social media can create. I'm very conscious in my own reporting that I haven't been focusing as much as what's going on in the DRC, that things are devolving in Haiti, that there's places all over the world that deserve as much attention and aren't getting it. With the situation in the Congo, even with death tolls, and also in East Africa and Ethiopia. I mean, I feel very guilty about that. I'm working on changing that on my own coverage. But what I do see, I think I completely agree. There's something about the citizen journalism that's been going on in Gaza, how the journalists themselves have become characters of sorts in this ongoing saga, as we see them and their families being allegedly targeted by the IDF. It feels very personal in a way that other tragedies haven't felt, rightly or wrongly. And I think that also has to do with the interrelationship between our own country and Israel in Gaza. When you see one of the early tragedies of this whole thing was that a former Congress member's family was killed as they were sheltering in a church.
Yeah, that's
Christian
Justin
Palestinians.
Amash. That's Justin Amash, the former Michigan congressman, actually running for the Senate now in the Republican Party. But yeah, he's a Palestinian Christian, and several members of his family were killed while taking refuge in a church in Gaza when Israel bombed it.
Right. And with nary a vigil from his former colleagues as a response. I mean, and when you see the ties between so many Arab Americans and what's going on in Palestine, at least two American teenagers have been killed in the West Bank, where ostensibly this conflict is not. It begins to feel very personal in a way that other things haven't. And now when you see this commitment of the United States to be fueling the crisis with one hand and paying to relieve it with the other in the form of this port that's being built, which of course, and I'm curious what you make of this, arguments that this is really a part of an effort to take advantage of oil resources off the coast of Gaza that haven't been tapped. And at this port, the investment is really about a lot longer term investment and being able to access that as opposed to delivering aid. All of it just feels like it's America's war in a way that certain other tragedies around the world aren't quite so viscerally. And it's difficult. It's difficult to cover. Obviously, that's the least of it. I'm safe and comfortable in a privileged position with respect to some of the people who have lost their lives. Over 100 journalists have lost their lives in Gaza. But honestly, I haven't seen very much like it. I think the image of the people who had been crushed under the wheels of a tank, that's one of the most gruesome images, the unfiltered version of that I've ever seen in my life. And how someone can see that and not want to immediately call for a ceasefire is beyond me.
Yeah,
I think it's beyond most Americans who very much do want to do exactly that. Those kinds of images are why people are saying no more, not one day more. This has to come permanently to an end.
Yeah, I think obviously when our own government is involved in a war, there's a tendency, maybe even a healthy one, to kind of focus on it more since we can actually do something about it more easily. We can put pressure on our government officials to stop it, whereas foreign wars in which we're not involved are much harder for us to really have an influence. I think it's part of it. But also, I think, one of the narratives we constantly hear is that the United States and Israel and our allies are part of this kind of advanced democracy, this advanced Western culture. And with that comes the fact that we have a military that is capable of doing a level of destruction and creating misery and suffering, unlike militaries that aren't quite as sophisticated. So you can, for example, as Israel has done, go and bomb an area filled with densely packed 2.2 million population, half of whom are children, and destroy 70% of their residential buildings, destroy their entire water supply, destroy all of their sewage system, make it uninhabitable for civilian life to be there, to siege the entire region so that no food gets in, so that you're purposely starving them to death. And a kind of evil and a kind of moral horror is capable and appears in a way that, say, other regions that are fighting with different kinds of weapons, I think, isn't quite capable of reaching. It doesn't mean that there's not horrors going on in those other parts of the world, but I think with this sophisticated military comes a higher degree of moral responsibility. And not only isn't it being fulfilled here, the opposite is being done, that sophistication of a military against a virtually unarmed population. It's not like two militaries are fighting. It's an unarmed population virtually against a sophisticated military. And this one-sided effort with the most powerful weapons in the world just being unleashed day after day creates a kind of horror that I think people have a hard time processing. Thanks for watching this clip from System Update, our live show that airs every Monday through Friday at 7 p.m. Eastern, exclusively on Rumble. You can catch the full nightly shows live or view the backlog of episodes for free on our Rumble page. You can also find full episodes the morning after they air across all major podcasting platforms, including Spotify and Apple. All the information you need is linked below. We hope to see you there.